Okay, we are live now. Uh, Good evening. If you're listening to this 4C Dialogue program on decolonizing minds and democratizing knowledge series, our inaugural discussion uh, is very much real world relevant and timely issue. That is Myanmar's continuing destruction of Rohingya group identity and their presence and their historical memory. And I have a very distinct pleasure um, to have two very distinguished scholars, um, Professor Michael Charney in London at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, and one of the finest scholars across Southeast Asian studies, specializing in Burmese affairs, particularly the 17th and 18th century, or even earlier uh, historical periods in Western Burma or today's Rakhine. He did his PhD at the University of Michigan on the emergence of religious communalism as opposed to ethnic communalism in 1999, and we've been friends, since mid 1990s. Then we've got Dr. Catherine Southwick. She is also historically trained, and she did her BA and Doctor of Law at Yale University, and did her doctorate at the National University of Singapore with a dissertation on the rule of law, theoretical perspectives, I believe. And Catherine has worked in, very international settings, Africa, Asia Pacific, and the United States. She was in the office of uh, the prosecutor in the Yugoslavia tribunal. She worked in the legal department in the State Department. She also worked on rule of law initiative with the American Bar Association, and she is a regular contributor on the subject of genocide or atrocity preventions. And she is now senior advisor on genocide or atrocity prevention on a project at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Genocide Studies. So welcome. Just to give a context, we are aware that the International Court of Justice that will have the hearings as part of the merit phase. In other words, looking at the evidence and counter evidence presented by different legal teams from the Gambia and Myanmar or Burma. And one of the issues that is hotly, or that continues to be hotly contested, is the issue of Rohingya group identity and their history. And also the younger generation of Burmese scholars have begun to confront the perennial issue of how colonial systems of knowledge production continue to plague the Burmese mind, if you will, and we produce the old colonial concepts and paradigms against our own communal interests, as including the construction of the Burmese or Rakhine or Burmese state history. So to get expert opinions, let me turn to Professor Charney to chime in and see where the status or the state of the Burma study is and how that relates to the current, the debates around Rohingya and Rakhine identities within the context of the post-colonial state of Burma today. Mike.
Yeah. Hi. So, the Burma studies today has been shaped around, through area studies, has been shaped around colonial era paradigms. If we had looked at Southeast Asia before the colonial period, ideas of how who makes up the country, who's included in the population, inclusivity as opposed to exclusivity, tolerance, this kind of thing. All these things were relatively prevalent in Burma before colonialism came in, and then colonialism shaped ways or provided tools of empire with which they found ways to divide the people, define them in certain ways so that they set them apart against each other, turn Buddhists and Muslims against each other, Hindus and Buddhists against each other, and so on, because it made it easier for the colonial state to rule them if people held each other in check, divide and rule. Unfortunately, the area studies we have today emerge from those colonial roots. The founders of the fields all came from the colonial period, and their purpose was to serve the colonial state. And to be fair to them, that's the way they looked at the world. They emerged in this system. Their students then went on to lead the continuance of area studies during the Cold War, when the kinds of divide and rule perceptions of people and places continued to serve strategic interests. And that's where we're left with today. Burma Studies, which views Burma as essentially Bamar speaking Theravada Buddhist. And that's what we think about. When we think about Myanmar, we don't think about all the different ethnic groups, all the different populations, languages, everything else. We see things through as symbolized through the typical Bamar speaking Theravada Buddhists. And when we learn about the country through area studies, and when we teach about it, we teach it through the medium of Bamar language materials and perspectives of the Bamar state. So that's where we are right now. And the other aspect of this, of course, is that the military has been in charge since 1962, even during the period of transition, still quite a lot of power, and they've reassumed that today completely. It's not in anybody's interest who would wish to get access to research in the country to question those paradigms. And so a lot of academics are complicit in their silence because they want access to the National Archives in Myanmar. They want to keep coming to the country. Surprisingly, you don't find this in many fields, but in our field, in Burma studies, you have a lot of academics who also have connections to the economy, are involved in one way or another through their families, and directly they have an economic stake in maintaining military control.
Right. In addition to the more obvious material interest of academics, like getting into different countries, often resource rich and, I wouldn't say like naturally, but typically conflict soaked places. What are the conceptual complicity that these academics may have? And I think in your latest, most recent piece that you published in the independent Journal of Burma Studies, you basically like dismantle the entire edifice of like knowledge making. And basically what you were saying is, well, this is my confession. Everything I've learned in graduate school, I need to unlearn. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm not. I mean, like you also in the introductory passages, you said if you agree with me, I failed, and I don't think you should feel you failed because I agree with you, because that's why we're able to speak the same language. And the some people say, okay, like the doctoral programs are about learning to learn.
Yeah.
And then now, like long after the doctorate, so we finished ours in the late 1990s, and then mine 1998, and yours 1999. And long after, decades after we finish our PhD, now we are learning to unlearn. And so,
Well, they should be about, getting a PhD, graduate education should be about asking questions, and it's not. It's constantly about go out there and reinforce what we've already told you, the paradigms, the ways that we shape knowledge about Burma. And so we get, I say, I had to step away from that perspective because, like all of us, I don't hold myself above anybody else. And when I talk to other people, I know that they have these images embedded in their heads, and it's going to take a huge intellectual jump for them or growth for them to move beyond these images. These constructs are so powerful. You can't expect to just tell people and it's going to be revelatory and they're going to accept it. It has to come from discussion and questioning and challenging these paradigms over and over again before people come around. It takes a long time. So that's why I say, if you agree with me right away, I failed, because I don't want people to agree with me right away. I want them to really think about it and come to this realization themselves.
Right, right. I think, that we are in the territory of what is generally known as deconstruction, right? You unpack concepts and images that are most fundamental, that serve as foundational building blocks of how we look at the world. And in your piece, like rather interestingly, you talk about this. The inheritance of these colonial knowledge paradigms or edifices, almost handed over from we're talking about Anglophone the knowledge production world, and so the leading dog was Britain, like Oxford, Cambridge, London, and those places, right? And these were also places that produced the greatest number of colonial administrators who went on to shape the perception, not only build, the colonies, cluster around the British Raj. Then you transition into post Second World War American, the area studies. Can you explain how that transition takes place? And then I want to invite Catherine, because she's also a historian by training as well, and so that I'm sure like she will have a perspective on. She grew up in Africa. Her formative years are spent there, and so it would be good to bring Catherine into this discussion.
It served the U.S. interests after World War II, with the retreat of colonialism, to take up the mantle that Britain, as a major global player, had played, and so the U.S. became the Britain of the post-war period, ruling through the spread of neoliberalism and democracy as champion of the free world instead of having an overt empire, and so they found it much easier, rather to reinvent the world, to just take the building blocks that were becoming disassembled as Britain was in retreat and work with those. It should also be pointed out that a lot of the governments that were truly anti-colonial, the ones that had radical new thinking and everything else, that came to power in many places immediately after independence, failed and were pushed aside because they didn't fit into this world order. They were challenged by the U.S. and other parties in the Cold War, and so they were displaced by colonial era entities, these colonial era militaries that then act in very. Now in Myanmar, the military presents itself as a champion of nationalism and was non-colonial, but actually it's the military that's the most colonial entity in Burma, and the values that they champion and the perspectives on the world that they have, and the anti-Islamism, the way they treat ethnic minorities, all of this. These are colonial era inheritances. We lost the shift away from colonialism with the demise of a lot of civilian regimes shortly into the Cold War.
Catherine, you've been following, the developments around Burma, including the efforts to start pushing for decolonizing, how Burma is presented in the policy literature, in the media, and all these narratives. And do you have anything to add to this debate that Mike and many of us have started?
Yeah, a couple of sort of resonances based on what Mike was saying, that I would also relate what he's saying as well to simply just the debate about whether genocide is or is not happening to the Rohingya, and how long that debate had gone on. Zarni, you wrote that piece, I think, The Slow Burning Genocide, in 2012 or 2013. There were other people in myself, 2014 and 16, pointing to that there was strong evidence, if not actual genocide, taking place against the Rohingya at that moment and before. But at the same time, there was a great deal of resistance among the quote powers that be, among the ones that you would have expected to be more open and on board, because they too, when I'm talking about sort of the international community kind of writ generally large, because their own sort of political and economic interests at that time were really shaping how they wanted to interpret what was going on and what they wanted to call what was going on. And so we also find that even when we have to be mindful that even in moments during the Cold War period and the post-Cold War period, when we were talking about human rights and promoting human rights and genocide prevention, often even those arguments are tied to promoting certain political or economic interests. Even now, with sort of growing sort of competition or tensions among authoritarian and democratic regimes in the world, the arguments for the promotion of these principles is so strong. But we also have to understand now this resurgence of promotion of these principles is also tied to certain political and economic interests and competition that's ongoing. So it's just something for people to be aware of about this sort of selective approach to what narratives we want to use at certain times, particularly among governments, and then the institutions like educational institutions and graduate programs that are somewhat dependent on state support in order to be, quote, successful. So yeah, so I mean, I agree with that, and I mean, I would be at some point. I have some thoughts about what Mike wrote about how the historical narratives have fed into the marginalization of the Rohingya as a policy by the regimes, but maybe Mike would like to lay out more sort of how that actually comes about and what the actual narratives are and how they've been constructed. And then I'm happy to kind of comment on how I see that fitting into some of the genocide studies frameworks that I've been work with in my work.
Yeah, Mike, as you would be very much aware, at the in the days of the Soviet Union collapse, that was preceded or triggered significantly by the fall of Berlin Wall in November 1989. The emerging narrative was that the present is not the problem. Right, it's happening right in front of your eyes. The collapse, the wall being brought down or borders being, redrawn in Eastern Europe and that part of the Eastern Bloc. But the problem was that the past keeps shifting. The past keeps changing. How could past be changing? Because it's supposed to be something that's fixed and packaged and sealed and done. But in your piece, you talk about precisely that. The past keeps changing, right? Whether it's the chroniclers from the conquering Burmese central dry zone state, or the East India Company, linguists and other explorers who, that came into Burma, or what is today called Myanmar, in search of the geographic information, intelligence about the palace intrigues, the communal relations, how to exploit them. Can you explain how the past with respect to recalling keeps shifting?
Well, if I could just clarify, and this would help to resolve some of this, is that when we talk about the past, that's everything that ever happened. That's like every chemical process, organic, that never changes, right? It's all out there. But we only have like 0.001% of all the data we're ever going to need to understand the past. So we pick a few dates here and there. We try to make sense of it. And that's what history is. And so history is how people try to understand the past, and the past is actually what happened. And they rarely agree. That's because people have an agenda, or the powers that be have an agenda. Their histories are written for a particular purpose, to explain the past to the people in the present in such a way that it makes sense to them or serves certain interests. And that's what a lot of the histories we've had from our kind have come out to be. Is people look at the chronicles as if they're an absolute record of what happened, and they're not. Right? It's just because data was put down in these Yazuan that serve the interests of the court at a particular time. Right? You look at the introduction to Ukala. Ukala says that he's writing a story to explain the rise and fall and goodness and badness of kings and this kind of thing. So when we look at these things, we only find what the courts wanted to see. And when we look at later histories of Rakhine, those Danyawadi, Yedapone, and other things that were put together in the late 18th century, 19th century, this was put together by Buddhist monks, not working for a court. Writing actually to try to preserve a Rakhine regional identity against Burma's central influence at a time when they had been incorporated in Burma. And the main enemy at that time for these monks was actually Myanmar, was the kingdom of Myanmar, not the Muslims. So the Muslims, rarely show up in these. And then people look today in these chronicles and say, well, where are the Muslims? And what about this? And well, the thing is, one thing you find is that none of these things hardly ever talk about this area of Rakhine where the Muslims predominate. They never talk about the tens of thousands of slaves who had been brought from what is today Bangladesh and so on, and populated in the 17th century, populated the Galadan River Valley and so on. There is no record, just like other oral-based societies, the Rohingya don't have a lot of written records, and this is a problem we find throughout Burma. People always turn to the Burmese state's view, their records, as the record, because they don't find anything for all these oral-based societies, and so we wind up with the Burmese state perspective on everything. Right. So the way that history, when the British came in the colonial period, they turned to these chronicles, and Burmese Buddhists, Bamar-speaking Buddhists, and Bamar-speaking Rakhine Buddhists to give them summaries, précis of the different chronicles. And so one particular perspective, one particular religion, one particular language came to represent Burma and its history going back. And this served the interests of colonial interests because they wanted to work through these Rakhine Buddhists in Rakhine, and they wanted to turn Burma into, the colonial Burma into what it became, British Burma. In which they could turn the ethnic minorities against the Burmese majority and help to keep control. And one of these constructs that came out of this that led into the Third Anglo-Burmese War was turning the Burmese kingdom in the pre-colonial period into this pillar of authoritarianism and absolutism and very violent kinds of rule. And they emphasized the killing of the kindred under Thibault and all kinds of very barbarous activities in the Burmese court that the British then come and they liberate the Burmese from. And so colonial rule is good because it brings democracy or some self-representation. It ends the barbarity of the Burmese government, and it brings Western civilization, Western ideals. And this is how the narrative has been shaped. It was shaped by the nature of this chronicle writing. This was reaffirmed by the colonial order. And this is what the Burmese turn to when they think of traditional Burma, is this this narrative that is privileged state, that's focused mainly on one particular language group and one religious group, and that's seen as traditional Burma. And it leaves out like 90% of everything else we need to know about Burmese history, which is the terrain of the different ethnic minorities.
Right. Catherine, do you want to jump in? And you seem to want to share something.
Yeah, and I as a genocide studies person in this discussion, I see this very easily connecting with some of the frameworks that we use to understand how and explain how genocides typically come about. And of course, as Mike says, a lot of history, we have this expression, history is written by the winners, right? And the people who are in power, and to some degree that's a conscious process, but sometimes it's sort of like a benign, not benign, but it's an unconscious process, because the people in power are the ones writing the histories, or who have the access. So there's and so forth. But in any case, what we are left with, the result of this in the Myanmar case is what Mike has described as sort of a Bamar-centered notion of Myanmar identity and statehood that is excluding Muslims or certain groups of Muslims, and in particular the Rohingya, and so forth. And so these colonial era notions of the Rohingya as foreign and, quote, Bengali has provided the military regimes with a very ready frame through which to carry out these critical stages of genocide, as outlined very nicely in the 2015 report by the International State Crime Initiative. And there are different frameworks that describe these stages, but a critical feature is the process of othering a vulnerable group or the targeted group, and that is to divide people between us and them, in groups and out groups, through identifying or manufacturing some basis for exclusion from the national community. So for instance, Firestein's framework, who I know you've interviewed him in a previous one of these things, but he talks about these interconnected processes of construction, destruction, and reorganization of social relations in the course of genocide. So the targeted group is, quote, negatively constructed as other, then suffer some physical destruction, with the end goal to reorganize society so that the cultural or social norms or features reflected in that targeted group are no longer tolerated and do not exist. So in that process of negatively constructing the other, we see dehumanization, the use of stereotypes, and scapegoating, which in turn feeds into policies, laws, and actions on the part of government and allied institutions of society to marginalize and possibly destroy the targeted group. Now, in 20th century genocides, and this is not surprising when you then relate it to sort of some of the white supremacist ideologies underlying empire in the 19th century, Ben Kiernan, another genocide scholar, has noted that the ideologies underlying genocide has focused on the purification of a race or religion or a territory, or reversing some perceived process of territorial decline. And you see this very clearly in Rakhine State and the concerns that people have about territorial integrity and purity. And these themes of racial purity and territorial integrity are closely aligned with how we define citizenship, whether on the basis of your descent, your blood, your race, or your presence on a territory through birth or long-term residence. And so that in turn, it leads us really clearly to the problem of citizenship and how important the citizenship laws are in terms of codifying and legitimizing these historical narratives that then shape the mindset of who is pure and entitled to be on a territory. And we have this, of course, in the example of the Jews in Germany, in Nazi Germany before World War II, who were then stripped of their citizenship and denied voting rights, and that statelessness or denial of citizenship set them up, as it has done in the Rohingya case, for further persecution and eventual destruction. As you know, and Mike points out in his paper that, of course, what this process of decolonizing history, I mean, the implications are that, of course, we need to go much farther than, citizenship laws are not the be all end all, but they are an important part. But it's just important to understand how this these historical narratives can feed into the policies and laws that then shape how people's access to rights and their security and belonging in the broader communities.
Catherine, I just want to share something here. This is from Working People's Daily. Can you guys see the screen share here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the top, just under the headings or the logo of the newspaper, Working People's Daily, from the socialist military era. The very first one, in red circle, is pure-blooded. It's basically, this is like a Chairman Ne Win, ex-general who masterminded the Rohingya genocide, as early as 1978. He said only pure-blooded can be eligible to bear the label as Dayinda or indigenous, right? So this is from 1982 in the he was giving a short address at the Citizenship Drafting Committee. The paper is dated 9th October 1982. This was the concept of pure-bloodedness and the indigeneity, another concept. They were invented by the state. And then the irony is that Ne Win himself was known, documented to be half Chinese himself. And so, the idea of like who is let me stop the screen share. Who is the how do I get that? Sorry, just bear with me for a second. Okay, the idea of who is indigenous, who is the son or daughter of the soil, and who migrated, based along, let's just say, Mike, as you said, like based on a religious communalism, faith. I mean, Buddhism was not indigenous to Burma. Buddhism arrived, from a northern, what is now northern India, right, Bihar and other places, and so neither was Islam, neither was Christianity, neither was Judaism or Hinduism, right? And then the Burmese adopted and made indigenized the Buddhism and Buddhist, the code, or more like a Hindu code, as if they were our own indigenous arising out of the soil. And then then all other religious frameworks and faith-based communities, right? And this process is very much, the half-conscious and half-zombie line, and the chroniclers are aware not to bite the hands that fed them. So they wouldn't say anything, like if you get like a contract with the World Bank, you wouldn't come up with something scathingly negative about the presence of World Bank or even its own existence. I mean, that would be against the interest of the scholars and chroniclers, right? So we've got something similar going. With specific respect to the Rohingya identity, you argue that Rakhine identity can be argued as fake as Rohingya. Like this is like paraphrasing your argument a bit crudely. Can you expand on that? Because this argument that you made earlier, the post 1962 military rule, contrary to what the late nationalist the historian Michael Alpin argued, did not liberate Burma conceptually or otherwise. It only resumed the colonial paradigm under the blatantly nationalistic the facade of the military rule, and but the very nationalist military and the very nationalist Burmese and others rely on the colonial knowledge to make to make the point that the Rohingyas were fake and Rakhines and Buddhists were the real. Can you expand on that one?
One of the problems with trying to counter the arguments that are made by the ethno-communalists and the racists and so on in Myanmar is that in order to disprove their points, you often have to respond on their terms, which means you wind up attacking the Rakhine Buddhists or saying things that are taken negatively by Rakhine Buddhists, and then you help to reinforce the racialist support amongst people because suddenly it looks like you're attacking the Rakhine Buddhists. The points that I tried to make in looking at the criteria they were using to evaluate and validate or whatever the right word for it is, the Rohingya, was if you applied those same requirements to the historicity of the Rakhine Buddhists, their ethnicity would fall apart. You would suddenly find that there's no evidence for almost anything related to them before the 15th century. We don't have the Bamar language, we don't have the Theravada Buddhism, we don't have the much of the culture. We don't have evidence for any of that. So if we're talking about you need evidence to prove that you've been there before, well, we have as much evidence that the Rohingya were there as we do of the Theravada Buddhists being there. Now, that's not to say that this is a fair criteria to use on anybody. I don't think we should be interrogating ethnicities like this, and we shouldn't be trying to remove self-reference on this kind of basis. It's just that if we use this criteria that's being used, well, if you turn it against the Rakhine Buddhists, you're going to find the same weaknesses in the historical record. That's just the nature of this kind of thing. What I said in response to the Michael Ong Twin point was that Michael Ong Twin had presented, as you mentioned, he presented not 1948, but 1962 as the beginning of the true independence of Burma. Because in his view, the military represented the true values and the true anti-colonial perspectives, and were taking Burma back. What I've tried to argue more recently is that, and I should point out that Michael Ong Twin can't defend himself. He has recently passed away, sadly. What I've tried to point out more recently is that a lot of the knowledge that's been, and this is global South. It's not just Myanmar. But a lot of the perspectives and values and everything else that are seen as indigenous now are actually those promoted to validate the credentials of colonial era institutions like the military that have taken over these countries. And that and a lot of it derives from the propaganda put forth by Europeans as an excuse to extend their rule over all these other areas of the globe in the 19th, 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. And that actually, when we look at what Burma was really like, what was important in Burmese society, for example, anybody could be a Burman. All it required was political loyalty to the king, to the court. And by virtue of that, as long as you supported the state, as long as you supported the country, you claimed to be Burmese, you were considered to be a Burman. There was no blood aspect to this. There was nothing like these citizenship laws in those days. These citizenship laws are rooted that the military started to introduce in the Tanya and Tha myth and everything else. The ideas behind the citizenship laws that were introduced from the 1960s leading up to 1982 by the military, these are all derived from European intellectual foundations and colonial administrative practices, and they inherit nothing from the pre-colonial period. However much they claim to represent the pre-colonial.
Yeah, just hold it there, because I want to share what I know. You know, we talk about the country as a Burma or Myanmar, Union of Burma, the Socialist Republic, or the now like Union of the Republic of Myanmar. But you know, if you look at like Burmese historical writings, you know, or poems or whatnot, we identify not countries or like states as such, but the towns, names of the towns. We call like the kings were fighting not between like the Burmese kings and Mon kings or Rakhine kings. The kings are fighting among different seats of political power. Bago versus Avar, right? Matapan versus like Bago, right? And then like your Mrau versus like Amrapura, right? And if you look at the census is not the European invention. Census all the ruling systems that they need some kind of information. And if you look at the 15th or 16th century censuses, you will find Armenians, Greek, Romans, right? The Arabs, the Portuguese, as part of what we call 101 races residing in a particular kingdom. But there were no differentiation, there were no segregation. As long as like their presence and contributions advance the interest of the guy on the throne. They're welcome, right? So the identity was around the power of the court. That's why you will find Japanese samurais who converted to Christianity, fleeing persecution from to Kyoto, ended up in the court of Siam, or Arakan court. And so, can you?
Well, if we could sum that up for everybody, is that these courts were very inclusive. Anybody could be a subject. They welcomed people. They wanted diversity. The more diverse the population was, the more of a world ruler the ruler was, and the more of a world ruler the ruler was, the more he was shown to rule according to the Dhamma, to the Buddhist law. But that included tolerance of all these other religious groups and what we might call proto-ethnic groups. It wasn't about exclusivity and forcing everybody to be a one blood and everything else. I mean, that article you showed about Ne Win, he's talking about mixed bloods, and he's saying that all these people came in just for economic purposes during the colonial period. No, they always came in because the Burmese court welcomed them. It didn't keep them out. There was no example of the Burmese court trying to force people out of the country. That's that's a colonial era thing.
I mean, the courts were patronizing, funding, different religious establishment, funding Christian missionaries, funding mosques. You see what I mean? As long as their presence serves the interest of the court. And so, sorry, Catherine, I saw your hand there.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to tie this back to genocide studies. If we're talking about, when we're talking about prevention of genocide, when you're trying to counter, and you have this feature of exclusionary nationalist ideologies, the prevention approach then is to counter that with narratives or ideologies around ideas of inclusion, tolerance, and equality among ethnic groups. And that ideology can then kind of permeate these other facets of national and social life. And what's so kind of tragic and interesting about what Mike has unearthed and writes about in this pre-colonial time is that Myanmar, or that time, there are homegrown narratives available to Burmese people, including Rohingya, to draw upon to sort of revive and to adapt to contemporary challenges and realities that they're facing. So that's what's that is actually a great asset. If you're trying to promote these ideas of inclusion and tolerance from the outside, but then if you find these reference points, within the context you're dealing with, you stand a greater chance of reducing atrocity risk in a sustained way, if you can really build on that in an authentic way. And this also brings me to this additional dimension of decolonizing history, or decolonizing, for instance, international law. There's another school of thought known as third world approaches to international law, which is also about looking to all these different contexts for inspiration to really rethink the principles that underlie and structure and constrain how we approach questions of identity and so forth. So, the older ideas of Myanmar citizenship and belonging could go a long way to enriching the way we think, the narrow ways we think about citizenship and who belongs, in a way that's much more useful to us as we look into 21st century challenges.
Yeah, Catherine, I guess since you're on the subject of the drawing on the past traditions, I also want to sound a cautionary note here, because we don't have a golden period or golden paradigm to return to. I don't think that's what you're saying, but I just want to make it clear, because the ideas of like a citizenship, rights and responsibilities is a very modernist concept. Like we didn't have a people as such. Is understood today, yeah. The kings own the lives and everything, right? Not just the territorial control. In the old the political traditions, a person can never be disowned himself. In other words, you can never out migrate as long as you're captured outside the territories of the king's court. You could be brought back, and you were owned by him, right? And so, but the earlier you talked about Daniel Feuerstein's, the expansion of a Lemkinian idea that genocides always have two two phases. One is the destruction phase, and the other one is reconstruction phase, right? And so, can you explain why genocides are so qualitatively different from other types of crimes, right? Like the around identity, because as you know, the Burmese military's foreign affairs, posted an official protest letter against the International Organization of Migration. IOM created a web page where it uses the word Rohingya, and it's meant or designed to preserve or conserve the memory and cultural objects and stories of the Rohingya, right? That suffer genocide or continue to suffer or be subject to this process. And then the military reiterated its long-standing the position, or I would say genocidal position, that Rohingya don't exist, or don't use that. And then recently, the Arakan army leader, using the language of the human rights and citizenship recognition, they said, well, we call them like a Muslims of Rakhine, yeah. And so basically, in a backhanded way, he also joined in, or like he was his discourses in sync with the Burmese military's statist discourse. The state does not recognize the Rohingya, therefore, the Rohingyas don't exist, and the colonial records also did not include Rohingya. Therefore, colonial states did not recognize the Rohingya. So can you explain like why this identity denial is so crucial to this the type of like a state-sponsored, communally supported crime that we call genocide?
Well, I mean that's why. Am I on mute? No. Okay. Yeah. But that is why there was a compelling kind of need. There was identified, you could say, by Raphael Lemkin, and then those who decided to create the international treaty known as the Genocide Convention, which dates to 1948, is to just recognize the unique element of destruction on the basis of identity. And in the Genocide Convention, it's based on like racial, ethnic, religious, national group, and they excluded other ways that people divide, such as political affiliation and so forth. And so it's an incomplete and politically kind of compromised definition, you could argue, just to be clear there. But I think it's partly that when we start looking at forming enemies based on identity, there's a very there's such a high danger that this becomes sort of essentializing and dehumanizing an entire group. And so this puts an entire group, an entire community at risk of destruction. And it's not just sort of people who are, and any crime against humanity and so forth, these are all terrible crimes. Let's just be clear about that. But when we add in this element of racial animus, there's sort of a heightened level of concern in terms of the threat to the community and how far it can go, and also just this very kind of innate capacity in all societies and to other And it's not just Myanmar, of course, it's the United States, it's everywhere in the world to sort of other the different groups. And so that's sort of why when we're talking about denying someone's the identity of a group, a person's group identity, these get close to, I mean, the sort of institutionalization of that is deprivation of citizenship. And it is that sort of dehumanization, denial of citizenship that enables, from the eyes of the state and society, that these people are no longer human, that they are no longer entitled to protection, and that they don't have, and they don't literally count. So once we've dehumanized and made stateless communities based on a sense of based on persecution, we diminish their importance. And I would even go so far, this may be a bit of a radical point, but the Rohingyas, the protractedness of the Rohingyas' plight and the extent of it for decades and decades, hundreds of thousands of people in Rakhine State, in Bangladesh, in these miserable conditions, in these constrained, really dehumanized, like shipping people to Basan Char Island and, you know, depriving access to food and starving babies, you know, and so forth. The notion that the international community has sort of tolerated this for this long, I think is also perhaps, I would submit, subconsciously rooted in a sense that because they're stateless, they don't have as much clout with us. And yeah, this is why it is so damaging, this identity denial and the statelessness.
Right. I think like that you hit the nail on the on its head when you talk about, you know, the states being basically the primary actor in the mobilizing, you know, this purist, you know, exclusionary ideology, and then other societal or communal groups jump in, right? And the to make it clear, you know, that I know, like, you know, our mutual friend Penny Green and colleagues in London talked about genocides as state crimes. So, you know, I would submit that genocides are extremely unusual type of crime in that, you know, neither states nor society have shown any type of human core and any type of ethics or principles as their guiding principle. So these are crimes where states and societies collaborate fully, right? So like, if you look at the Burmese society, we have been against the military dictatorship for decades. Yeah, as long as the dictatorship has existed, and so has the resistance from the society, going back all the way to 1962, right? So that's like, you know, almost 60 years societal opposition and resentment against the military, making itself the ruling class of Burma. And yet, when it comes to this identitarian persecution with the intent to destroy the entire group, the society, you know, forget about the fact that the military was their perpetrator also. They join up with the perpetrators. The Rakhine's the same thing, right? The Rakhine's been like colonized by the Burmese as Central Court, and then, like, you know, the British move in, and then we were all like, you know, subject to equal opportunity occupier, which was the British. And then when we regained independence in 1948, 74 years ago, we started to oppress one another, you know. And so I want to invite Mike to comment on the role of the state. That you talked about, you know, communities that are outside the states are brought into state spaces, and then those who are already in the state spaces, such as the dominant ethnic groups, Burma, or the religious group Buddhist, they are made to look at others, you know, basically as aliens, or like, you know, how do you create these, like, you know, state-centered mindset that in turn get to advance any strategic goals that those who control the state might have.
Well, I'd like to actually say a couple things, and one of them is that Catherine brought up I mentioned the U.S. briefly, and I don't think we pay enough attention to the role and the responsibility the U.S. had in a lot of this. A lot of the stuff that was directed against the Muslims were actually memes and other things that had been constructed by the Americans, and for some reason, places in continental Europe like France and Denmark were particularly prominent in creating these from 2001, these very anti-Islamophobic images in social media that they were then used. A lot of the hatred directed against Rohingya, that wasn't done on the basis of showing people what Rohingya really looked like, but on adopting a stereotypical view of a Middle Eastern Arab sheikh with the AK-47 that then came to represent the international Muslim threat and to Myanmar. And even the idea of that international Muslim threat is something that was derived pretty much from the West and came to circulate around. The question you're asking, though, is why is the state paradigm why is the state view so important in all of this? It's because the state has won out over other types of international influences. The state, as Guterres had mentioned, the state paradigm has trumped the human rights paradigm, and we're living in a world right now where states hold all the power, and so when you hold the power, you control how people view things. In Myanmar, that's the case. The military controls the state. And so how the military views things, how it controls knowledge, the flow of knowledge, how it constructs things, that's all important in people's minds. The other thing I want to raise, though, is that, again, to draw attention to the to deflect maybe some of the criticism that might be made in a knee-jerk response to some of the things we're saying, maybe from Rakhine Buddhists, is that there's no question that a lot of the Rakhine Buddhists genuinely believe a lot of things that they believe. They have a view that they're the indigenous population of the region and everything else. There's been no problem in the past of multiple communities all having parallel claims and debating this and so on. It's only now that this has been instrumentalized in a very hostile way towards other groups and a kind of exclusivity promoted. So all of these things have come together. These Western-derived what is the word I'm looking for? The demonization of the Muslims that's been derived from the West and has been helped to circulate through Western-controlled social media. The growth of the power of the state relative to other kinds of perspectives, and the instrumentalization of maybe animosities sometimes, but maybe just rivalries that had existed in the local terrain growing up from the colonial period. These have been mobilized by Ethnocommunalists in terms of direct hostility towards the Muslims in Rakhine. All of these things have come together. So we can't really separate. We can't just blame the Myanmar military. We can't just blame Myanmar. We also have to point fingers at the West and the international community. And academics played a big role in this. They played not only a role in promoting the continued role of the military in the government from 2011, but they also stood by and remained silent when all of these problems are happening and things they know should not be being promoted by the government and by the military, standing by and not being critical of this because they want access to those archives in the country.
Yeah, I mean, the international awareness around the atrocities in Burma began around 2012 when Aung San Suu Kyi first made her first ever, travel back to Europe, stopping at the International Labour Organization in Geneva, and then, finally coming to Oxford to receive her, honorary doctorate and deliver her address at the British Parliament. This was 2012. And, I noticed for the last 10 years, Burma studies as a field, whoever the individuals, both the great eminences and, the young stars or the upstarts academics, you can count with your one hand how many people say this is wrong. Yeah, we are scholars of Burma, and the state that we specialize in is committing atrocity. It doesn't have to be genocide. You don't have to wait until genocide is determined by any court of law if that's ever needed. That you have to, just jump in and say, the state that we have studied, entire life is committing, major international crimes, and we will raise that. That's not the case. I mean, that.
Yeah, the response by most Burma studies scholars behind the scenes, it's been silenced officially, and then behind the scenes, it's, well, the Muslims, they really don't belong there, or it's not true that the Rohingya are indigenous, or something like that, and somehow condone the violence that's occurred, condone genocide against them regardless of what they view as the past, or which histories they accept, which narratives they accept. They condone the violence through silence and by acceptance, by at least tacitly accepted this as within the purview of the Burmese state, or the Burmese military, to deal with the Rohingya this way.
Just to add to what you were saying, I mean, like, from a very personal perspective, not only do they, condone the violence and the atrocities by their, deafening silence, but they actually keep someone like me, at the gate. You see what I mean? That most of what I published is in, law school or international affairs journals, right? And that never once did anyone from the Burma studies ask me, do you want to speak on this subject? Yeah. Or like, do you want to write a short essay or commentary, right? And this is not out of the desire to matter to the Burma studies, but I'm just like saying the extent to which they will go out of their way to make sure disrupting voices such as mine,
there's silencing. There's silencing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of silencing that goes on. Once you're critical of anything the military does, the invitations stop, and you have to.
Yeah. But anyway, let me return to Catherine. Catherine, what is the international law perspective on the minorities' rights to self-identify? Irrespective of history, irrespective of the politics surrounding the identity formation. Does international law say anything about the right to self-identify? This is like a purely legal, technical, not conceptual. You're muted.
Oh. Yeah, well, it's been widely accepted and promoted, this right to self-identification repeatedly, including in the context of Myanmar, as many of the past UN rapporteurs on human rights in Myanmar have affirmed, and it goes directly to the basic principle that underlies many of the international human rights conventions of non-discrimination. And that, again, I just want to emphasize, non-discrimination is again at the root of countering genocide or atrocity risk in general. And so that's why self-identification is so important. Self-determination, again, there's a wide range of what we mean by that and what the rights are. It's highly contested. That's the big caveat. But the idea is sort of safeguarded under notions of non-discrimination that appear in many international human rights treaties. So, and again, it's so important, again, in terms of countering the attempts, very powerful attempts to deny identity on the part of the state and allies of the state. So yes. Yeah, so I had a couple other observations that are somewhat related, but I don't know if you want to stay on.
No, yeah, please carry on. And then, I'll hand the mic over to Mike.
Yeah, and I'm not sure when when you close, but in any case, I guess one of the questions I had in this idea of decolonizing the history, and in terms of really getting at like what the goal is here, what is the impact that is you either Mike or Zarni or anyone would be seeking here because part of it is, I mean, what I gather is that it is in part, well, to just be historically complete scholarship purely, and to eliminate the distortions that we've talked about of economic political domination, but also to somehow show perhaps that, you know, being anti-colonialist is anti-racist, that the racism in society is based in part on these colonialist distortions. And so then perhaps, you know, this might then persuade some people to kind of discredit or give up these perspectives that have been driving Rohingya marginalization, and then more broadly, you know, marginalization of other ethnic minorities. And I think, yes, that if that's part of the goal, I can see that. But I also just want to point out that from the perspective of genocide prevention, the problem is that leaders who see some benefit to scapegoating any group will find another tool. So we might, you know, through decolonization, take away the capacity to instrumentalize history against any targeted group. But if people in power feel the need that you know, targeting a certain group is serving them, that a nationalist exclusionary ideology is serving them and keeping them in power and preserving their interests, they will find another tool. So there is also then the question of like digging deeper to look at what is underlying the need to hold on to these narratives. Sort of the fear, the uncertainty, past trauma, anything, and in terms of looking at prevention, sort of digging further down into that and engaging people at that level as well.
Yeah,
Mike, you want to share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was going to say, it reminds me, okay, there was a similar argument that we won't mention the name, but a law professor friend of ours had made a similar argument that all the other stuff we were talking about doesn't matter because you really just have to emphasize the rule of law and, you know, international norms and this kind of thing. It's not exactly what you're saying, but it was a similar kind of argument. And yeah, that's true, is that ultimately that's what has to happen, is that there have to be legal limits and the state doesn't move beyond a certain point, and people have protections and civil liberties and everything else. But that's something that lawyers and others have to tackle. For those of us who deal with history and everything else, one of the things that we need to do is try to make as many people aware as possible of how artificial these narratives are and reveal that all these are being used as tools and everything else. Because I think that different ways of excluding people wind up with different results. And I think this particular way in which they were othered led to much more violence than maybe another way would have. And so maybe a better way forward better result would have been that maybe they were defeated at the polls. Maybe there are different ethnic group parties, and because of this othering, the Rohingya lost at the polls, and so all they lost was a person in the House of Parliament or something, National Assembly, instead of 800,000 people being forced out of the country and 20,000 rapes and all these deaths and everything else. So that's one result of all of this. The other thing I wanted to, but I agree, both things have to be pursued, and the legal, changing the law is much more important. In the law, that's the way you can guarantee that at least people won't be, or help to assure that people won't be brutalized in the way they were. There's still discrimination, lots of discrimination in the United States against African Americans, but people aren't being lynched, or at least not every year like they were until 1942, because there are certain limits that have been enforced and accepted. And well, I won't digress into this tangent too much further. The other thing I wanted to raise, though, while everybody was talking, was that, and something I tried to mention in the piece I wrote for SIA, is that there is a claim made by many of those academics that if you get involved in these matters, if you're critical, if you question the national narratives and so on, that you're somehow being political, and academics don't do that. Academics shouldn't be political. But it has to be stressed here, certainly before we sum up, that that if you have made a choice to preserve your career by staying silent on things that are within your academic remit, to serve the interests of the Burmese state or to avoid any type of conflict with them, you are in fact being political. Ironically, the people who are doing their work and questioning the authenticity of these narratives and doing this research, they're the academics. The academics who are sitting silently in a group and saying, well, I won't get my visa if I do this. You guys are the political ones.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think, like, the way I look at it is like, you cannot learn to swim unless like you get in the swimming pool or in the river or in the stream. You cannot be like we are not neutral observers. We all participate in the way we articulate things or we frame things. Yeah, that whether we keep silent or like we shout. That we are part of the reality that we study. That we are not quote unquote like natural scientists that look at the behavior of the atomic particles. I mean, and the other point is that Catherine, you asked about what should be the ultimate aim of the decolonization. What will it achieve and what should it achieve, right? I think I go to Frantz Fanon. The colonial relations are like mutually dehumanizing. And that those who dehumanize others dehumanize themselves as well. If you deny other people's humanity, you also deny your own humanity, right? Assuming that there is a universal acceptance of certain things as human and humane, like empathy, for instance, right? And you don't need to know people. You don't need to know animals. You don't need to be a dog when you see a dog being kicked. You feel pain in your body, right? When a car like runs over a little pussy cat, like you feel the pain. You don't have to be a cat, right? To feel that pain and the psychologically. So I think like we need to destroy decolonial social or institutional relations. Otherwise, we will be less than humans. Whether we are being oppressed or we are being part of the oppressing perpetrating group. And so this cuts both ways. So what people don't seem to the overlook or the underappreciate is that the perpetrators who dehumanize the other and then proceed to commit all kinds of atrocities also dehumanize themselves, right? And so I think Mike talked about the collaboration, right? And then if you study the rise of knowledge systems or like the growth of knowledge anywhere in the world, there is no pure group, like mathematics or philosophy or religion, whatever, science. This is a human contribution, irrespective of the origin, the geographic location, right? These centers shift, right? Now the centers of the economic power and political and military power seem to be shifting again, and so the movement toward decolonization ought to be understood in a more global movement of power, right? So that's why, like if we are enslaved, we wouldn't be in a position to talk about decolonizing master's knowledge, right? Obviously, many of us brown and yellow and black people feel more confident to quote unquote talk back and offer alternative, better and more humane. This isn't. I think that we need to, like Saeed said, we need to move away from the putting things in boxes. This is the West. This is the Orient. You see what I mean? Because these things themselves are constructive entities, and so yeah. So anyway,
Can I just
both of you take turns and give you last words each.
Yeah, I guess this can be kind of my last little response is that I mean I agree with you in that this dehumanization of the other also dehumanizes that person who does it. But and somewhat relatedly, another important point to raise is that when a state discriminates against a particular minority, that should also be seen as an indicator to the rest of the people that the state has a willingness to discriminate, has a willingness to apply laws unequally. And they're doing it now with respect to this group. But because you're letting them do it, you are giving them the impunity to do it in another scenario later that could have a much more direct impact on you. And so this is what some professors like Lani Guinier have called the discrimination against minorities is a canary in a coal mine. So this can be something that can metastasize. And I think this has also been recognized by many of the protesters in the Nuevu movement and revolution over the past year against the Myanmar coup, when they have sort of come to recognize that the persecution of the Rohingya is now is a reflection of broader persecution by the regime. And then the last point too, I want to augment on what Mike was saying of like, yes, the law and the historical narrative issue and decolonization, these things are worked together. I mean, they really must work together. You cannot change a law unless people have changed their minds. And sometimes, but you can change a law and that can also help people change minds, but really to actually get the law changed and for people to adapt the law, they need to have a certain story or understanding. And some of it may be completely historically factual, but it's also about a little bit of embellishment and storytelling and adapting these narratives that can sort of serve the needs of the society, the contemporary society, using some tools from and experience from history. And then the last point I would just say is that I would also see this as another form of justice. So we have you mentioned at the beginning, there's this ICJ case, there's the ICC case, there's this justice stuff happening in these rarefied institutions that are, very constrained in terms of, in various ways we can discuss in another panel. But I see this as well. There's been an injustice in denying the identity of the Rohingya and the role that the historical contribution and place that the Rohingya have occupied. And so this in itself is an act of providing some modicum of justice. And it's important as well to sort of think of justice and narratives of justice as broader than what is happening in these faraway institutions and even in the halls of justice in one's own country. So that's my last point.
Thanks. So Micah, you have the last word.
I think that was the way Catherine put it was the best way to wrap up. What I would like to do though is reemphasize in particular her first point. And reflecting back, I think one of the mistakes that was made before 2020, before February, in dealing with the Rohingya issue is that it was presented as exceptional too often. And what would have gained more ground and helped probably the Rohingya more is if we had emphasized more what happened to them as an extreme example of the way in which the military was dealing with many different ethnic groups. We don't have to wait. We don't have that thing like first they came for me, them, and I did nothing in this. We don't have to wait for that because they were doing this. They were actually mistreating severely people in the Shan area, the Kachin area, and rapes and murders and this kind of thing. It's just that it was so intense and so extreme with the Rohingya that it demanded a resolution. There had to be help for the Rohingya, but we should have presented more this as a countrywide problem, not just faced by the Rohingya, but faced by all ethnic groups, and not just ethnic groups. I mean, it's just other groups too, Bamars who aren't Buddhist, and anybody who can eventually be othered. I mean, this is a big problem. So I think I'll end with that, just to reaffirm in particular Catherine's first point.
Yeah, thank you very much. My own last, the 30 seconds is that, the cases of genocides are essentially the clearest indictment of failure of all of us as a civilization, right? And interstate systems, the global institutions. The fact that 75 years after the Holocaust ended and Auschwitz was shut, actually, like 27th of January 1945. We still talk about genocide, Uyghur genocide. We're talking about Tigray in Ethiopia, and now been talking about Rohingya for God knows how many years. Yeah, for the Rohingyas that they've been talking about this for 40 years, and so like the interstate system, i.e. the United Nations, had let the genocides happen over and over and over again, all over the world. And the world of conscience has not been strong enough, unified enough to say our human civilization will not have it anymore. And therefore, this is actually way beyond Burma and Burmese states' failure. This is actually failure of the United Nations system, despite the fact that we've got legal instruments and institutions put in place as the direct result of the Holocaust. And so, this is not a very encouraging the way to wrap it up. But I think we need to know the reality so that we could figure out how to build a better set of realities. And so you've been listening to Dr. Catherine Southwick, the Senior Genocide Prevention Advisor to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And
also, I should note, I've spoken in my personal capacity, and I'm a contractor, not directly affiliated there. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Now, Naomi, did you hear that? So anyway, the other speaker is Professor Michael Charney, the professor of Southeast Asian Studies and the military history at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Both of them are very distinguished and passionate scholars. And thank you so much for listening. And we'll be talking about the ICJ case in the weeks in February, if and when ICJ organizes the public hearings in the case known as the Gambia versus Myanmar. And thanks so much to both of you. Thanks, Catherine, for getting up early.
Thank you.
Thank you.